Hello and welcome everyone to the second week of Foundation 612. Tonight we're going to talk about methods of research and how to write really good descriptive research goals. Before we get into that, just a couple of housekeeping items. A couple of people have written to me about the CITI modules that I listed on the course schedule. Remember, I just put those down for different weeks just as a guideline. You do not have to do them in the weeks that I wrote them in. But a couple of you said that you have already done them, maybe in another class, or you've done them at another time. And if you've done that, that is excellent for you, because all you have to do is upload that certificate in assignment number 10, and you'll have that assignment done. So that's really great news for you. And also down for this week, we have sections, some sections that are left in the first part of the book, but there were also the sections, I believe it was topics 20 through 24 in the textbook. So I'm going to scan those and upload those also, just on the off chance that some people may have not gotten their textbook. I personally do not have a copy of the textbook. I have a digital copy of it, so I'm able to read it online, but I don't have a physical copy to look at. So that's a couple of things that I just wanted to go over with everybody. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out and contact me, and I'll be glad to discuss any questions that you have. So let's jump right in. So what are the steps that we need to follow when we want to work on the research process? What are the things that we need to know? We follow a scientific method. We try to make sure that we approach it very logically, very methodically, and put a lot of effort into our understanding of what we're doing. First thing that we always have to do is clearly identify the problem. Make sure that you really understand all the nuances that are in the problem and clearly state the problem that you are looking at. The second thing is that we need to establish the hypothesis. What is it that we think is going to happen? Collect and analyze data. Draw conclusions about the data that we have analyzed. What does the data tell us as someone who has studied it? Make recommendations based on the data that we have received, and also make future recommendations for other people to research. So what are characteristics of research? First, we want to make sure that we obtain our data from primary sources. You want to always go back to the initial source for any information that you are using. If someone did a study in 1950 and it hasn't been replicated, but other people have written about it, you want to go back to the original 1950 study so that you can thoroughly understand the limitations, the conditions, the sample, all those things that happened in the original primary source of information. Also, when we are thinking about what we want to research, you don't want to just take something that's already known in the research community and just restate it or try to reorganize it and have that be your proposal. We also want to make sure that any findings that we find from our research proposal can be generalizable to the entire population. When we do our research proposal, we always select a sample size based on some criteria we'll talk about later in the course. But you want to make sure that even though your data proves certain things for the sample size, that you want to make sure that this is generalizable to your entire population. And remember that your research proposal is a very formal document. There's certain criteria that research proposals should follow, and it's a very formal, intensive type of writing. It's very systematic, and like I said, it is very intensive. It has a lot of parameters that you have, certain things that you have to do. We do want to make sure in our discipline and when we do research that it's going to be based on the scientific method, because we want to have very scholarly and reliable and valid information when we present our research. And a major component of this entire process is that we want to make sure that any decisions that we make from our research will be based on data. So we want to use data-based decision making. So if you look in topic 20 in your textbook, you'll see some of this information in here, and this is just another way to talk about your proposal. It's going to lay out your proposal. It's going to say, this is exactly how I'm going to do my study. And you're going to say why this study is important. Maybe it was done, like I said, in the 50s. Maybe it was just done 5 or 6 years ago. So why are you revisiting it? What's the value that you can add to this research information by redoing this study? So you're going to state your problem or your objective that you hope to achieve. You will have a literature review to support the reasons that you're studying this particular problem and the relevance it has to the topic at hand. And you will also have a detailed description of how you're going to design your research. What are going to be your variables? How are you going to collect data? What are going to be the methods that you use to analyze the data that you have collected? So your analysis, your methods. And also you want to make sure that you don't forget the human subjects part of it, like we talked about last week. So you need to ensure that you cover the ethical issues such as confidentiality. So remember last week we talked about the empirical approach to research focuses on these, the who, the why, the how, the when, the where. And you have to have these things in your research goals so that it's very clear to the reader that they know exactly what it is you're trying to determine. So we're going to look at a few sample problems and try to see from the initial write-up what's missing and what we could do to make it better. So let's look at the very first one. It says, a study of the influences of religious training upon achieving the good life. Well, that sounds fine because it's a good lofty goal. It's a nice statement. But what are the things that we are leaving out? What are the variables that need to be operationalized in here? Where does this statement say, who are we going to talk? Who are we going to study? What will we determine once we study this? And what's the purpose of doing it? Why is this relevant? Why does this add value to anything? Why do we want to do it? If we reword this and we say, the problem of this study was to determine the effectiveness of adult Sunday school. Okay, so that's telling you what we're studying. Where? At Sunnyside Lutheran Church. In getting parents, so that's the who, to raise their children to practice religion in their adult life. So you can see how this makes it very clear for the person who is reading your problem to understand exactly who, what, why, where, and when. So this answers all the questions. Let's look at a second one. A study of technical education in Virginia. That's a very relevant topic. That's very good. So think about that for a minute and consider ways that we could change that. What are we missing? One way would be to clear this up by saying the purpose of this study was to determine the employment trends of students who were marketing education program completers, because that's a career and technical education term, at MK Technical Center in Transylvania, Virginia, so the need for the program can be projected. There's other ways you could say this. There's other things you could say about a study of technical education in Virginia. This is just one example. I'm sure that you can think of many others. Okay? Problem number 3. A study of standards of learning, the SOLs, in Virginia. To reword this, we would say the problem of this study was to determine if there's a relationship between Norfolk Public Schools students' SOL scores, standard of learning scores, and overall intelligence testing scores. Why? To determine if SOL education that is mandated in Virginia is improving student achievement. So here you can see why this is a valid and purposeful statement and a reason to do this particular research goal. So what are the things that we have to think about when we want to choose a problem? I mean, all of us can certainly say there's a lot of things that we know out there that we would like to study to see why they are the way they are. But what are the things we have to consider before we undertake some of the lofty goals that we may have in mind? First of all, is it something that we can get the information, get the data, get the primary sources to research it? Is it really something that's researchable? We also have to think about the financial considerations. It's really nice to say, I would like to study every education system in the United States to see why there's such a disparity between the educational level of students from some educational systems versus ones in other states. But think about the financial considerations behind that. That's why things that are like that are such broad, encompassing types of research are usually done by large, maybe nonprofit or other types of organizations, but they have huge financial backing because it's very expensive. Even as an independent researcher or as a student researcher, when you have to do things like send out surveys or you do opinion polls or focus groups, you have financial considerations because usually to get people to participate, if you can have an incentive, that always helps. And so you have to start adding in all these, the time, the effort, the printing costs. There's a lot of financial considerations. And going hand in hand with that is the time requirements. Is this particular research goal going to take you a long time to gather the data that you need to make your conclusions? What are your time constraints? How long will your population, your sample size, be available for this particular research? Do you have them for the period of time that you need them? What are your administrative needs? And that goes back kind of hand in hand with the other two. You know, how are you going to get all the things that you need, maybe the documents, the papers, anything that you might have to hand out physically versus doing it online? How are you going to get that done? And then, you know, the reality is, what is your research competencies? What are the things that you feel comfortable doing? You know, it's one thing to say, I would like to test these fifth graders before I give them a treatment, and then after they've had the treatment, and that's a simple t-test, and that's, you know, pretty much within everybody's capability. But sometimes doing the more intense and the higher levels of research where you have bivariate correlations and things like that, that may not be the things that you want to undertake. And so you have to just understand when you set up your problem what your own comfort level is. And then the significance of the problem. Just because it's significant to you doesn't necessarily mean that is significant to the entire field that you are involved in, or it's significant to others. So you kind of have to field test your ideas, and this is where you work with your chair and you say, okay, this is what I'm thinking I want to do, you know, and you talk it back and forth and you get some input from others. And there's some other things that you will see on the handout that goes along with the homework assignment and the notes for this week that talks about some of the problems that we have, some of the considerations you have when you are thinking about your research problem. So we talked some about this last week, but again, we want to talk about these because these are the three main types that in the social sciences we do mainly for our research studies. You can have one that's historical, which doesn't mean it's about history, but it's describing something that happened in the past and how it's correlated to today. Descriptive describes what is, and experimental describes what will be. So when we talk about historical, it's to reconstruct the past and to look at it in relation to our hypothesis or our objectives. And it interprets things that we know have happened to help us understand what is happening now in our research area, and to predict things that might have been in the past and went along with it. So historical is when you take something that you know has already been done and you're looking at it and you're analyzing it and trying to generalize it to what's currently going on. So here's an example. The problem of this study was to reconstruct the practices of teaching high school computer applications during the past 20 years to determine the basis of concepts that are currently taught. So when you really think about it, because computers have changed education exponentially, but the way that they have grown and really become an integral part of everything that is done in education, it's almost hard to think back 20 years. You know, you think back to 2000, some of you probably don't even remember, but you know, everybody thought computers were going to crash because that was Y2K and what's going to happen and the whole world's going to come to an end because of the way the coding and all was done in computers. But here we are, and we've made it. So it's very relevant to say, what we did 20 years ago up through the current time, let's look at it so we can determine how we're currently doing things in the classroom. So let's talk about descriptive, which is a more prevalent type of research that we do. And this is to look at something and describe it very systematically and factually and accurately. And what you do is you describe and you analyze the present nature or position or process that's going on in a situation. Whoops, excuse me. Well, my computer wants to act silly. Hold on. So let's talk about this one. The problem of this study was to determine the demographics of Hampton Roads secondary business education teachers to project future supply demand. So you can say, okay, let me go out and do an analysis and see currently what do we have in Hampton Roads for business education teachers. You get the data and you say, okay, so now I can look at this and let me try to determine if there's going to be a change, if it's going to stay the same, or what's going to be the future supply and demand that's needed in Hampton Roads. And you do that based on all the criteria that you collect when you go to the system. So in descriptive studies, you do a survey to describe something, an area that's an interest or a given situation. It's developmental, and it also can talk about a cause or a field or a case study. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say cause. A case study or it's a field study, and we talked about some of these last week also. These are things that we know are very qualitative because you're getting input from people. It can also be correlational, so you can try to investigate how one factor corresponds to another. Or we also talked some last week about this. It can be causal comparative or ex post facto, which is Latin to mean after the fact. And so it means to analyze possible cause and effect relationships. And if you look back in your book or in the PDF of the book that I supplied, you'll see some more information about this under topic 5. And then the last that we're going to talk about is experimental research characteristics. And so this was the one where it says you give treatments, or you have different groups. You have one that's the experimental group and one's a control group. And the focus on this is the cause and effect. So you have to be very careful about your variables. You have to clearly identify your variables, and you have to very carefully manipulate them for the purpose of determining how these variables affect the outcome of your research. So here's an example. If I can get my video cam out of the way so you can read it easier. The problem of this study was to determine the effect of lecture versus hands-on instruction in teaching problem solving for 6th grade science students, so that we can determine what's going to be the best teaching practice. So if it's truly experimental, you expose one or more groups to one or more treatment conditions and you compare the results. If you have very tight control of the population and the procedures that you are doing. We also have quasi-experimental, where you do have some control, but it doesn't allow you to control all of the variables very, very tightly. And this example here, they say if you have Mrs. Christian's 6th grade class versus Mr. Gray's 6th grade class, you can't say that those samples are exactly the same, or you can't control all of the variables in those classes. Then we have what they call action for experimental, which is develop new skills or approaches to problems where it's going to have a direct application, or something that you can, it's a new type of, or a new way of doing something. It's an action that can bring about something different in classes or a training environment. So we've talked about goals, and we've talked about how to make sure that they cover all the relevant points. But how do we decide what our goals are going to be? This is probably something that you have an idea of, but sometimes it's a little harder to decide exactly what you want. So the reason we write research goals is we want them to be ideas or projections of possible outcomes, and we got to make sure that we don't have any bias in them. We don't want to try to put a conclusion in your goal. We want to present a framework for analysis of the problem in relation to how we want to analyze it, and indicate what we think the research will lead to, and give us another set of conclusions. So this is the what and the why. We want to make sure we clearly articulate these. Research goals should represent what you want to end up with rather than the means. And research goals should help you stay focused on your literature and your data collection, because if you have very tight, concise, and very well articulated research goals, you won't go off on tangents, which is very easy to do when you start reading literature and you find something very interesting. You stay focused on your research goals, and you won't end up with irrelevant literature, or you won't collect data that maybe took you a lot of time to collect, but once you start to analyze it, really is useless when it relates back to the goal. The research goal should be this really strong framework for you to be able to collect your information and then state your conclusions in a way that's going to be very meaningful for you, but also meaningful for the people who read your research. When you answer your research goals are in chapter 1, and you say, this is the reason I'm doing this, these are my goals, this is what I will accomplish by the time I get to the end, which is chapter 5. So when you get to chapter 5 in your study, you should have answered all your research goals or problems, and the study should be concluded. So when we talk about experimental research, which we talked about, it usually states its research goals in the form of a hypothesis. So if you see topic 24 from the book, you will read more about that. If you do a historical or a descriptive research, it usually states its goals in the form of objectives or questions to be answered, and that's topic 20 from your book. So an example of a descriptive type is a study of block scheduling. So you would, if you wrote your research goal like this, you would say the problem of this study was to evaluate the effectiveness in implementing block scheduling to determine what form of scheduling should be adopted by the school in Kissimmee, Florida, or Kissimmee, I'm sorry. So the problem of this study was to evaluate the effectiveness of block scheduling. So here are some questions that we could come up with. Does a change provide more academic options? That's one of my questions. Does a change provide greater success academically? Does a change reduce disciplinary problems? So this is your goal, and here are some questions that clearly state, once this is my goal, and once I gather my research, I should be able to answer these questions. Does a change to block scheduling increase non-lecture teaching strategies? What form of block scheduling should be implemented at the school? So here's another one, an experimental study of football players. The problem of this study was to determine if the sleep habits of Elizabeth City State University football players were predictive of their university cumulative GPA. So here's the problem of my study. Here it is restated. And here's my hypothesis. Now see, this is different because this time we are saying the problem of the study was to determine the relationship between their scores and their sleep. So this time I'm doing an experimental study, and so I'm going to say my hypothesis is there is no correlation, and you'll notice that this says HO, so this means the null hypothesis, and the null hypothesis says there is no correlation between the sleep habits of Elizabeth City State University football players and their GPA. So I either want to prove or disprove this. So at the end of my study, I would say the null hypothesis is correct. There is no correlation, or my research has disproved the hypothesis. So we get to the thing that probably causes a lot of anxiety for a lot of people, which is how you report your data. And everything that we do in this is guided by APA, which is the American Psychological Association. And this is normally the format that you use. So the APA method is what guides most of all of our writing. And so you see a paragraph here, and you see at the end, this is at the end of a paragraph. This is not a direct quote, but this is a paraphrase of information taken from this particular article by Argonne in 1998. So this is a paraphrasing of what was in this article. So at the end, so this is what we call the in-text citation. And at the end of your document, this is your reference, and you see how this is done. I think the biggest thing that trips most people up, hopefully not y'all because y'all are in grad school now, but undergrads have a hard time with this part right here because it seems so contrary to what you've always learned, that you capitalize the first word in a title. So they want to capitalize recruitment, technology, education, teachers. But in APA, you only capitalize the first one unless it's a proper name or part of the subtitle. This is the title of the journal from which it was taken. This is the volume, the edition, comma, and this is the page. So APA probably, like I said, gives people the most headaches that I know of, and I will tell you unequivocally that I still sometimes when I write something, if it's something different that I'm not used to citing, like web pages or court proceedings or something that I haven't done in a while, I always either pull out my manual that I bought when I was doing a lot of writing, because to me it was easier to have a book because I put little markers and I could just flip to it, or I would go to the OWL at Purdue. So we have the APA manual listed as a recommended source. So it's personally up to you. If you're more comfortable looking things up online and you like to do it that way, then the OWL at Purdue is an excellent resource. But if you're a person that likes to have a book beside you for a quick reference and you put little tabs and markers and, you know, whatever you use to flag the pages, but you need to really try to concentrate and pay attention to APA, because it's probably, next to the statistics, it's probably one of the most difficult things that you have to do. So we're going to go out and I'm going to show you the OWL at Purdue in just a minute. But just to summarize this lesson for this week, you know, we talked about there's three major types of research that we do. It's historical, descriptive, experimental. So historical is what was, descriptive is what is currently, what is, and experimental is what will be, what we hope will be after the treatment. We also talked about what are research goals and when do you use research goals. So think about this. When would you use a hypothesis? And then would you use objectives or questions? Do you remember the difference? A hypothesis. We use the hypothesis when it's experimental. We use objectives when it's descriptive or historical. So let me close this out real quickly and we'll go to the OWL at Purdue for just a second, just so I can show you in case you're not familiar with going to this website. It's just, you can just Google with the OWL at Purdue and then look for APA. It has an introduction. And it says that the 7th edition of the APA manual are now scheduled to be published early in spring of 2020. I put the 7th edition in there because they were originally saying they were going to publish it a little bit earlier, but I guess they haven't quite gotten to it yet. When I go to this web page, this is where I always go right here to the formatting and style guide. And because it has this wonderful little search right here, you can search through this way, and it tells you, it gives you step by step how everything should be on your pages. And you can come over here and search what you're looking for, or you can look over here in the different sections. So if I wanted to do something that was an in-text citation and I needed to know how to do it, I could click on this and just go straight to that part and be able to look it up. So this is really nice to have. It tells you exactly. This is if you have the sentence with the people's name in it. If you want to say research by Wegner and Petty, you put the date. But if you write the sentence and you want to put it at the end, they show you how to do it. So this is an extremely helpful website, and I hope everybody will become familiar with it because it does help a lot. So this concludes the presentation for week 2. So if you have any questions or comments or need anything, just feel free to contact me and I will get back in touch with you as soon as possible. Thank you.